One of the youngest known Holocaust survivors shared his story with the Rockford community today, more than 80 years after 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered by the Nazi Germany regime between 1933 and 45. Mark Olski was the featured speaker of the Jewish Federation of Greater Rockford's annual Holocaust Memorial Observance at Rockford's Midway Village Museum. In February, CBS's 60 Minutes featured Olski and 2 other survivors who were born during the final weeks of World War II to moms who concealed their pregnancies while imprisoned by the Nazis.
Yes, it happened. We need to understand it. We need to understand the kinds of things that people do to get other people to suppress their humanity.